Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right. Welcome to the Stoa, everyone. Happy New Year. For our first and only Sense Maker in Residence series, it's Evan McMullen. I like to call him our homegrown sense maker, which is not entirely true because he's been doing his own thing for years on years as a hermit, apparently. But I'm happy to say that the beacon of the Stoa attracted this man, this genius to us. And I'm very happy that we can give the gift of Evan to the world from this beacon. And so this is going to be a series on bridge building. And if you, I imagine most people here attended the first session or watched the first session, at least on December 5th, called The Bridge Rationality to Woo. And this is going to be a continuation of that. It's going to be a series of 4 deep dives. Session 1 is going to be on neurophilosophy. That's today, bridging models and reality. Session 2 is going to be on embodied practice, bridging mind and the world. Session 3 is the bridge in Communitas, and there's a word I don't know or understand in that phrase. And then session 4 is where do we bridge from here, bridging science and magic. So I'm quite excited about this series, and I can sense the excitement in the Stoa bubbling up right now. So 90-minute session, you know the drill. Throw your question in the chat. I'll call on you, unmute yourself. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that in the chat. And that being said, I gave Evan co-host access so you can share your screen, and I'll take you in, my friend. Happy New Year.
All right. So yeah, Happy New Year to you and everyone else. It's been a wild ride in 2020, and I can only imagine it's going to get more wild this year. So let's buckle up. It's so structure-wise, going to be similar to the first bridge session. I've got a short presentation that I'd like to do to sort of set some grounding. It's shorter than the one we did the first time because I'd really like to just see where the collective wants to take this as far as Q&A. There's a lot of directions you can go with neurophilosophy that are super interesting and useful. And so I'm just going to give some basic sort of bones to the topic and then see where we want to take this through the Q&A format as far as where people want to explore in this territory. So yeah, if it's all good with you, Peter, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen from my other device, and we'll go ahead and get started with that. So let me get that going. Share screen, share. Cool. All right. So, oops, that's the wrong window. There we go. And how do I start this? Cool. So are you guys, okay, a little bit of lag there, looks like. Cool. So everybody see the first slide now? Yes, I do occasionally read an eminent metaphysics. It's a guilty pleasure of mine. So first session of the deep dives, we're going to be taking a look at neurophilosophy. So I'm just going to start out by defining the term as I'm using it. What is neurophilosophy? So in my usage, neurophilosophy is the sort of philosophy which is informed by and not too inconsistent with the experimental results of neuroscience. So pretty compact definition there. So why might we be concerned with specifically neurophilosophy? Well, in the first bridge session, I was really hitting hard and emphasizing the importance of what I called phenomenological self-inquiry, which is a sort of blanket term for things that you might think of as, insight meditation practices, but not at all with a restriction to a sort of Buddhist sense of that. Just in general, the process of observing and reflecting on the observations made with respect to your own mind, your own phenomenological experience. And so most of the traditions, the ancient wisdom traditions from which we get the techniques and practices of phenomenological self-inquiry, these traditions also come entangled with, well, for the most part, pretty garbage epistemologies, ontologies, axiologies, and metaphysics. So I think a lot of us have a sense of that. And especially for those of us who took the STEM bridge, the bridge through science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education from Keegan stage 3 to Keegan stage 4 that I was discussing in the last session that the David Chapman piece over on meaningness, which inspired the title for this series, goes into. Well, for those of us that took that bridge, this is often going to cause us to do some combination of these three things. We might reject the entire tradition, its theories and its practices. So think about any number of people you may know who don't want to do something like meditation because it seems unscientific to them because of how the traditions that generated these practices do have pretty garbage philosophy and little understanding of physical reality. Or maybe we decide to selectively mine these traditions for practices while rejecting the theory. Well, this is probably the least bad of these three responses, but it is fraught with some amount of danger because a lot of times the order of operations of the practices and their mutual interdependencies are explained in terms of the theory or the philosophy of these ancient traditions. And so if you discard all the theory and philosophy, you might run into some real trouble with respect to the practices. And then the third option that I see a lot of people taking is replacing some aspect of their modern views with the pre-modern views and frames embedded in these traditions, which can lead to a little bit of a split in our worldviews. You know, I think probably all of us have met someone who is some sort of science or technology professional who also has some bit of a spiritual or esoteric practice, and they sort of just seem to be doing a bit of cognitive dissonance there. They don't really try to reconcile the two things into a coherent world model, and that seems problematic to me. So some important questions that are suggested by philosophy in general would be, what sort of thing is a self? What sort of things exist? This is the question of ontology. How do we know, and what does it even mean to know something? These are questions of epistemology. And also, I would say another question is, what sort of principles can we even in principle discover about the world? And this has to do with the sort of philosophy of science or meta-science or something like that. And these are all some really important questions to try and get a handle on. So we're going to try and go through a little bit of that today. So when we start looking at the self, when we do phenomenological self-inquiry, we start from the experiences and the insights that we gain from doing practices of phenomenological self-inquiry. We notice that there's a very different landscape there than the one that we previously might have thought existed. Specifically, although we may notice some felt sense of selfness, it ends up being pretty much impossible to pin down as having specific and stable attributes. And also, it's not there all the time. Even if you don't engage in a direct practice of phenomenological self-inquiry, if you've ever done, say, athletics to the level of getting into a flow state, you'll probably have noticed that the sense of self may be absent or at least sharply diminished in that flow state. Obviously, during deep, dreamless delta wave type sleep, there's no sense of a self or really anything else going on. Certain drug experiences can cause the temporary loss of a felt sense of self, and certain psychiatric conditions like Cotard syndrome are diagnostically determined by, among other things, having no sense of self. Depersonalization, derealization experiences pop up all the time in the psychiatric literature. So, and when the self is there, it varies significantly in terms of its felt sense or its phenomenological reality. In terms of what we might call its noticeability, its intensity, its transparency, its salience, something like that. And so I just stuck in a quote from Bucky Fuller that I really love. You often see parts of this quote. He says, I live on Earth at the present, and I don't know what I am. I know that I am not a category. I'm not a thing, a noun. I seem to be a verb, an evolutionary process, an integral function of the universe. And this is the sort of conclusion you start coming to about the self when you engage in phenomenological self-inquiry, which Bucky Fuller notoriously did. So, okay, here we go. The slide takes a second to update. So these noticings that we get from the phenomenological self-inquiry are pretty deeply incompatible with our inherited framings. So, for example, the Abrahamic religions, which are a deep cultural basis of most Western cultures, teach to a first approximation that the self is very real and that it's eternal. Western psychology and the mainstream, and again, to a first approximation, also treats the self as a real entity, a noun rather than a verb, a thing rather than a process, although it usually does admit the self has a finite duration. Now, this is changing a bit as Western psychology integrates some of the insights of neuroscience as well as the traditions of phenomenological inquiry, but it's changing pretty slowly. Western philosophy, going all the way back to Plato and even before, also treats the self as an ontologically real thing. This is also changing, but not universally, and also, in my opinion, way too slowly. So because of these things, these ingredients that go into our shared cultural milieu, the ways that we have been conditioned to make sense and meaning of our experiences in Western societies have been really heavily influenced by these streams of culture and ways of knowing, this sort of reification and thingification of the self. So what sort of things exist anyway, and how can we find out, since we're sort of getting into some territory where maybe the self doesn't quite exist in the sense that we thought it did? So, we can find out by, say, one, doing a lot of phenomenological self-inquiry, and two, learning even just a bit about what scientists have been finding regarding the brain and its relationship to the self. We can then combine steps 1 and 2. With a brief nod to South Park, the step 4 here is a bit confusing, and then we profit. Cool, it's awesome. We have some new sense of things. So let's talk about how we actually do this. So if we're going to take a look at combining phenomenological self-inquiry and neuroscience for fun and profit. So we've got a couple options. One is to sort of start from the base of the phenomenological self-inquiry and go from there. I do just want to give a shout out to David. He pointed out to me that phenomenological self-inquiry had the acronym of PSI, which I completely had not noticed as I was writing out the previous presentation, since I wrote it out every time. So that was fun. So I'll be using that abbreviation in the interest of space in this presentation. So we start from PSI and go from there. So when we do this, we notice that the self doesn't seem to have any sort of stable existence. We also notice that the objects that we actually interact with seem to be entirely mental. We notice that the mental state influences nearly everything about what is experienced. Our subjective phenomenological experience is very different if we're happy or sad or excited or angry or horny or whatever. And so when we do this inquiry a bit deeper, we notice that the only things that really seem to be ontological primitives within this field are sensations or moments of experience. And everything else is built up from these atoms. Or we've got a second option. We could start, as many people here probably have, with the neuroscience and go from there. So with neuroscience, we actually reach some startlingly similar conclusions. Most of the things that we directly experience don't seem to exist out there in the real world. They only exist as patterns over time of neural activity. So things like colors, discrete physical objects like cats and dogs and tables and computers, even our emotions and feelings, our thoughts, our subjective sense of a linear passage of time, all of these things pretty provably don't exist in the underlying reality being described by physical science. So, that's interesting. And most interesting is that this most definitely includes the concept of the self. The self is a thing which doesn't exist out there. It only exists in here. And so we further, through the neuroscience, start to notice that the brain seems to be some sort of modeling function of the organism, which evolved, as everything else did, to serve the survival and reproduction of the organism in which it's embedded, by predicting the results of potential motor actuations and mediating between conflicting proposed motor commands from various other parts of the body and brain. So this seems to be why we even have these big complicated and glucose hogging brains. So interesting how we get to some similar territory, whether we start from phenomenological self-inquiry or we start from the currently existing state of the neuroscience. So we might then ask ourselves, what sort of thing is the self anyway? Well, since it's not stable, it probably seems like it's not likely to be ontologically primitive, even when we start from a place of phenomenological self-inquiry, ironically enough. Also, more on the neuroscience side of things, the self seems to be generated primarily in certain regions and networks of the brain. And we actually know how to turn this off with the appropriate stimulus or damage. So by lesions in certain parts of the brain, or stimulation, electrical or transcranial magnetic stimulation of specific parts of the brain, seems to be pretty reliably able to deactivate the felt sense of having a self. And also, we've noticed through the neuroscience that the brain does many other things. Most of the brain is not, in fact, dedicated to generating the felt subjective sense of a self. And in fact, this is probably not the primary purpose of the brain, is having a self. It's modeling the universe and the organism's interaction with the universe for the purpose of survival and reproduction. So, come on. So now let's ask ourselves, well, what sort of things do exist? Okay, so like based on our previous analysis, we might say maybe two different kinds of things. We've got these mental representations, including things like the self, and then we've got reality, whatever it is that physicists are studying. And you might respond, well, okay, isn't this just dualism? Well, yeah, sure, but we're not done here. So mental representations do seem to be emergent properties of reality. Whatever the reality is that physicists are poking around with when they do things with their particle accelerators, that does seem to be more ontologically primitive than mental representations. And mental representations do seem to somehow emerge out of that. So, okay, only reality exists. We're into some sort of monism then. Well, maybe. We're getting into some really thorny issues of what we actually care about when we ask these sorts of questions. And so this is one reason why the meta-systematicity of Keegan's stage 5 is so useful, because the answers to these questions end up being context dependent. What are you trying to do in this moment determines the right way to ask and answer these questions. So this gets into something I like to think of as meta-systematic philosophical pragmatism. And so I'm suggesting that the answer to the question, what exists, is not singular and is context dependent. So this might have very different answers if what I'm trying to do right now is be less miserable, or if I'm trying to do novel physics, if I'm trying to find some sense of well-being, of being okay with the unfolding of my life. Freedom from suffering. If I'm trying to come up with a specific treatment for a specific psychological disorder or malady, et cetera, et cetera. Like all of these tasks might suggest quite different framings of what is ontologically primitive, what are the atoms of the grammar of reality, essentially. And so the ability to be fluidly meta to these systems of ontology and meaning is crucial, because the way that we answer the above question will be different in different domains or contexts if our goal is to be as effective as possible at dealing with these different domains and contexts. So there's something that I've heard called virtualism. I kind of like that name for it, which is a bit of a squaring of a circle with respect to idealism versus materialism. So idealism is the sort of classic philosophical position that the world is in essence being dreamed by a mind, and mind is that most ontologically primitive thing. Matter is not ontologically primitive, it is emergent from mind. Now, materialism is sort of the opposite view, that the world is made of matter, which is the most ontologically primitive thing, and through the interactions over time of matter, minds are emergent, they evolve, and so minds are not ontologically primitive. So one way to square this circle is something that people might call virtualism, where we say, okay, the entire phenomenal world is in fact being dreamed by mind. Also important to note that this mind that's doing the dreaming of the entire phenomenal world is not identical with self. The self is actually part of that phenomenal world that is being dreamed by mind. But wait, that sounds like idealism. So then we move on to the next step and we say the mind is being generated by the brain of a social primate, which exists in a reality, which mind does not and probably never can have direct access to, can only deal with through processing indirect signals. So to continue on the theme of virtualism for a second, we can say that reality, in the way that I was using it on the previous slide, is likely to be something on the order of a unified quantum hypergraph. Mind is this emergent functional or computational process of a fairly well-defined subset of that graph that gets defined through its interaction through a fairly well-defined systemic interface to the rest of that underlying graph. The phenomenal world then is a virtual reality or virtuality that's generated as part of this evolved emergent function of mind, and likely evolved sort of for the purpose of predicting the results of actions taken by this organism, in our case a social primate, in whose body this mind is being hosted or generated. And then, so what's the self? Well, the self is the sort of avatar in this virtual reality of the organism whose body is generating the mind. And this self is always situated in some phenomenal world. I know that might have been a controversial last statement, but I want to make the note that when we talk about experiences like very high jhanic states or nirodha samapatti or cosmic consciousness type experiences, that there is almost universally an absence of what we would normally think of as a phenomenal world associated with that, and often even an absence of the self associated with that. So that's a thing to note for later. So what does virtualism do for us? Well, I think it provides a better framework for people in sanghas or meta-sanghas to discuss the results of their phenomenological inquiry without requiring them to make too many deeply questionable philosophical claims. Okay, so this is important because otherwise you get a lot of sort of impedance mismatch communication issues between different people who have done different types of phenomenological self-inquiry because they're unable to square that with their shared frames for describing objective reality. So this gives us a little bit of a common meta language where we can sort of translate some of the insights that we may have during our self-inquiry into a shared way of communicating and refining our inquiry as a sangha, basically. It also helps us resolve some of the confusions of this eternal debate between idealism and materialism, which has been a big topic of Western philosophy since, 4,000 years ago or so. And as a bonus, it also helps us resolve some of the confusions of monism versus dualism, which is another perennial Western philosophical debate. Not just Western, you see this in Eastern Indic and Indic philosophy as well. So we can say that the phenomenological world, this phenomenological space generated as a virtuality by the mind of a social primate. This is the world that monist idealism is talking about, where everything is being dreamed by some sort of higher mind. Cool. And then reality, this underlying quantum hypergraph, is what the monist physical materialism is talking about. Cool. And so then the trouble of reconciling those two things into some sort of coherent understanding has to do with the overloaded use, semantically overloaded use of words like, I said word there, that's a typo, I meant world, universe, reality, etc. in philosophy. And so dualism ends up being a sort of confused attempt at reconciling the semantically overloaded use of words like that in everyday and philosophical conversation. At least that's my take on it. So we can then talk about some of the connections that virtualism has with what I was pointing at last time with the discussion of Keegan stage 5 or meta-systematicity. So meta-systematicity seems to help us in the development of newer and better systems. For example, those people who originally started describing the ideas that I'm referring to here as virtualism, people like, among others, Thomas Metzinger or Dan Dennett, for example, were operating, I believe, from a meta-systematic frame. In terms of how they're able to reconcile these different systematic understandings that they'd inherited through our culture and our academic culture. So we also have to be careful, though, when even dealing with a new shiny systematic understanding like virtualism, we have to be careful to retain the capacity to be meta even to these newer, better systems. For all of the reasons discussed last time, and if you want to really go deep into this, read all of David Chapman's Meaningness. No system is going to be complete. No system is going to be consistent. No system especially is going to be both of these things. So we should bear that in mind, even as we find these newer, shinier systems that we discover through applying meta-systematic understanding and generating craft through that. So similarly, virtualism solves some problems really well and others poorly, just like any other systematic way of understanding. So one nice thing about it, one thing that I think it does well is I do think it seems to gesture in the direction of meta-systematicity. So it sort of includes and accepts the appropriate domains of application for both idealist and monist perspectives and implies that neither is entirely true. Idealist and materialist perspectives, my bad. So, it implies that neither is entirely true. So what we get from this is a sort of pointer at meta-systematicity. We sort of have to be meta to idealism and Mosism to fully take up what virtualism is sort of pointing at there. So I want to point out some interesting connections with what I just had up on the screen before I threw out the presentation with The Eminent Metaphysics by Forrest Landry. So according to Landry, science is an exploration of objective value and mysticism is an exploration of subjective value. I think this is quite resonant with what I've been pointing out about the fact that science and phenomenological self-inquiry, which maps on relatively well to what he's describing in his work as mysticism, is in fact very similar knowledge quests applied to different domains of the subjective and the objective. It's sort of a very similar thought. And so, like I mentioned, this gestures at this common knowledge quest format of the practice of science, as well as the practice of phenomenological self-inquiry and many different wisdom traditions. So Landry describes 6 paths in total, of which the above are 2, science and mysticism. The others concern purpose and value, and I actually should have said purpose and meaning there, from the subjective and objective frames. I'll fix that before I share the presentation. And it's important to note here that the sort of investigations that we have focused on so far do not result in the expression or the exploration of questions of purpose or meaning, okay? Not really. And purpose and meaning are essential to a well-lived human life. So science and phenomenological self-investigation, self-inquiry, or mysticism, they ground the sort of space of play. They let us figure out what sort of world we're living in. Science grounds our understanding of the objective and outside of us reality. Phenomenological self-inquiry grounds our understanding of the subjective internal phenomenal world. And understandings are not enough on their own. We are the sort of beings who care and love and act, not just understand. So that takes us to where we'll be exploring for the rest of the series. So the next section of the bridge is focused on embodied practice as a way of bridging the world and reality as described here today. So by the world, I mean this phenomenological inner world that we explore through the practice of phenomenological self-inquiry, as well as that outer objective world, which might be some sort of quantum hypergraph. And then we can lean into the way that this bridging of our inner world and reality is intertwined with questions of purpose and meaning. The third session is going to focus on how what we've covered in the first 2 sessions interacts with the notions of communitas, and will involve a further exploration of the questions of purpose and meaning and their interrelationship with what it means to love life and other beings. And then the 4th session gets a bit more speculative and focuses on some bridging and synthesizing of the worldviews of what we normally have called science, including the recent additions to science like virtualism, with the worldviews and practices traditionally referred to as magic with a K, in service of purposes and meanings which are compatible with the preservation and further flowering of the lives of thinking creatures and cultures on planet Earth. So that's where we're going with this, and that's the end of my presentation today. I really wanted to get a good amount of time to get some feedback and questions from you guys and explore whatever's come alive for you during this share of mine.
Awesome. So start putting your question in the chat if you haven't already. And thank you once again, Evan, for breaking my mind around that virtualism argument. I'm like, okay, bye-bye. So I'm going to ask you a very simple question, and it's going to go meta of this whole lecture series. And we talked about this before you even launched it, but who is this for? You know, what's your audience for this series? Because it's not for everyone. A lot of people are not going to get this. It's going to be over their head. So who you're hoping this reaches to?
Well, I guess I would say there might be 2 answers to that question. The sort of primary intended audience is people who are in what Chapman talks about as this nihilistic chasm of stage 4.5 in the Keegan stages, right? So somebody who has achieved rational, systematic understanding of the world, they're operating at that level, and they've gotten a bit past that, and they may have fallen into what he calls the chasm of nihilism. So being unable to ground things like meaning, like purpose, into any sort of coherent frame or worldview, and therefore experiencing a lot of personal distress, perhaps a loss of effectiveness at maybe work, or more importantly, in the project of noticing and solving what we around these parts call the meta crisis, to try and give some juice to people that might be stuck in that chasm and say, you know what, there is still a way to recover a sense of meaning and purpose and value and care for the world from a place where you may have lost connection with value systems, greater meaning, spirituality, religion, etc., if that makes sense. And now the second possible audience is people who may not be in that group. Maybe they do have some sort of Keegan stage 4 relating to things, but they didn't come to it through the sort of STEM bridge that Chapman talks about it. And maybe this series is just intriguing enough to get people interested to figure out, okay, what comes next? Even if this material doesn't land for them so much, because it's not going to land for everybody, like you pointed out, maybe it energizes a quest in those people to find something that does land for them, that's approaching similar territory.
Very cool. Okay, so we're going to pivot to the questions now. We'll start with Gordon.
Yeah, so I tracked some of this, maybe even a lot of it, but I got lost with the discussion of quantum hypergraphs. Not familiar with the term, and so a lot of the whole virtualism discussion, I was just kind of trying to keep my head above water. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you mean by quantum hypergraphs. My quick Google search went way too, it's way too detailed of what's coming up in my search results for me to be able to look at. So can you expand on that just a little bit?
Yeah, so I just threw something in the chat, which is not particularly easy, but probably the best intro to that concept that I can think of. It's something that Stephen Wolfram wrote April of last year. The basic idea of a quantum hypergraph is that when we start getting really deep into physics, you've probably heard of the paradigm of information physics, something like what David Deutsch likes to talk about. So the sort of hybridization or noticing that information theory and quantum physics seem to be describing very similar underlying territory, right? That you could describe quantum physical phenomenon in terms of information theory. There's a whole field called quantum information theory that goes into this, right? Okay. And so when you take that up and you start looking into it, you start noticing that even things like the concept of dimensions, right? So like spatial dimensions, dimensions of time, you have these things like string theory that say there's some number of dimensions that's greater than 3, there's 4, there's 7, there's 26, there's whatever, right? You've got Einsteinian, Minkowskian space-time with 4 dimensions, cool. Well, in a sort of quantum information theory type approach, you end up getting to the place where you find that dimensions don't have to be ontological primitives of the universe, that they can emerge from a non-dimensional graph structure, meaning a structure that is simply defined as some number of nodes and some number of connections between those nodes with a very simple algorithmic rule for a transition function that moves the graph into the next state. And so you get things that look like 3 or 4 n-dimensional space-time emerging if you run that algorithm iteratively or recursively enough times from a very simple starting graph. And so at least with the sort of quantum physicists that I sort of think are on the right track, this is the sort of favored type of model at the moment. So when I'm referring to the sort of world that physicists study, the objective external physical universe, that's what I mean when I say the quantum hypergraph, is that seems to be the understanding that physicists are perhaps reaching about the nature of the physical universe. Does that make some amount of sense, hopefully?
Somewhat. So I mean, I used to try to track with this stuff, and then I had kids and don't have the attention span to be able to just sit down and digest it enough to follow the quantum physics of it. So I think what I'm getting is that so key point was this notion of a graph that does not require dimensions. That's a mind bender already, because since elementary school and before, graphs had an x-axis and a y-axis, right?
This is not the sense of a graph in the sense that you draw a graph in algebra, you draw a parabola or something based on some polynomial function. Okay, this is not necessarily that. This is the graph in the sense of like the data structure or the mathematical object called a graph, not the visual representation thereof, okay? And this is defined as a 0-dimensional structure, which is defined in terms of nodes and connections between the nodes, but no dimensions. So that's what I mean when I say graph in this sense, not like I'm graphing a function.
So it's a representation of things, nodes and interconnections that playing out over iterations of a process produces something that looks like dimensions. So it becomes something that can be graphically represented.
Sure.
Am I?
Or we experience dimensions, right? Because you could talk about the interaction between the phenomenological world and the objective world. So the subjective and the objective, right? So as I sort of just gestured at in the presentation, if our brains are essentially some sort of predictive pattern recognition machine, if our brains are some sort of predictive pattern recognition machine, then essentially we are trying to figure out regularities in the inputs into our brain, right? So our brain has a switchboard type area, a specific area of the thalamus that sort of like allows us to receive signals and routes those signals to other parts of the brain that actually do the pattern recognition. And our brain will then configure itself into a form that allows it to predict what's going to happen in the next moment. So, you know, the neurons get rewarded if they successfully predict, and they get not rewarded if they don't successfully predict. This is a bit of a simplification, but it's good enough for our purposes. So essentially, what we're talking about here then is that given the current state of the recursive application of an algorithm to the initial graph structure, then we are at a place in the evolution of that where the simplest possible data compression that a limited computational system like our brain can do on its inputs is one that looks at things like dimensionality, that observes or predicts things like three-dimensional space, right? But that's important to note that that is a property of the models that exist in our brain, not a property of the underlying lowest causal layer of the universe, which is just the graph and the algorithm applied to the graph in each time step or whatever.
Dimensions are emergent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
So is it possible to can you give a nutshell summary of virtualism without reference to these quantum hypergraphs?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Could you give a nutshell, you know, the elevator pitch of what is virtualism without reference to the quantum?
Oh, sure, yeah.
And this will be the last follow-up, Gordon.
Sure. So the elevator pitch for virtualism without talking about quantum physics at all is that there's some world out there, and we don't have access to that world. We only have access to our sensory inputs as they hit our thalamus, essentially. That's what the part of our brain which generates our subjective experience has access to. And so it's important to distinguish between whether we're talking about the world as we experience it versus the world as we hypothesize it exists out there based on experiments we do, say, in physics or chemistry or what have you, and that to conflate the two is essentially like a category error, if that makes sense.
Cool. I think that answers Laura's question. So let's go to Rob Hart.
Hey, thanks. So on this idea of like using virtualism to sort of explain what's happening in development, I started looking at Keegan 3 as the stage in which these computational processes called minds start to gain coherence with other minds. It's like they've got a computation algorithm for what the other minds are doing. At stage 4, it starts to look like that's where the mind has maybe computational competence at coordinating systems with and for other minds. So not just, oh, I get what's going on with you and I can mirror it, but also I could design a system in which you could cohere with others, or I could orient myself within one of those systems and take part in it, not just be pushed around by it. So viewed from that lens of virtualism, what would you make of stage 5? Like, how would that change the picture of what's going on with the computational system?
Yeah, so if we look at this from a sort of evolutionary perspective, we can say that for social primates like us, the primary driver of our evolutionary fitness is generally going to be our social status, right? Like how well we fit in with the tribe. Being ostracized was tantamount to death in our environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, right? So as our brains are modeling, there's going to be some built-in stuff that says what's really important to model is other people, right? And their states. And so you could think of, I think, stage 3 as being the place where the modeling function has gotten enough data input and iterated enough times that we essentially have the ability to decently model our local social fabric, okay? That's essentially how you could view stage 3. You could then view stage 4 as the ability to not just model the social fabric, but get good enough at modeling the social fabric so that it's not just taken as an immutable aspect of reality, but the leverage points are seen by which it can be changed to some degree, right? And like you were mentioning, now we can create systems that allow people to cohere in different ways and so on, right? Cool. Okay, so then stage 5 would be essentially the noticing of the modeling function that it contains many locally consistent but globally incoherent models, along with the noticing that achieving full global coherence is probably beyond its own modeling capacity, because the system doesn't just model others, it models itself too. That's part of what we call the self, right? And so the combination of those insights of the model would then lead us to a sort of meta-systematic frame. Hopefully that made sense.
Yes, which kind of leads to the question, is it possible to shortcut to stage 5?
I have no idea, honestly. In terms of the progression, as to the extent that I've experienced it, and to the extent that I've known other people who seem to have experienced it, I don't think I have any personal reference points of shortcutting to stage 5. Now it's important to note, and Chapman and Keegan both go into this, that stage 4 is absolutely not exclusively like a STEM thing. That's just the most common bridge from 3 to 4 that we have in our current society. But there's many other ways of bridging from 3 to 4. Some might have to do with institutional religion. Some might have to do with the study of the legal profession. Some might have to do with simply being involved in large bureaucratic structures, okay? So that being said, I don't know anyone that's managed to avoid any of those things and has managed to do this progression that we're talking about, shortcutting to stage 5. Though, of course, there is the insight that's occasionally talked about in these sorts of studies that stage 5 is actually the underlying sort of capacity space of human beings in general. And all the other stages in some weird, strange, loopy way actually sit on the stage 5 capacity for their very ability to exist. So maybe there is a way to do that, but I certainly have no idea what it is.
And could you clarify what you meant by shortcut, Rob?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the idea of going through stages in a linear direction would mean you've got to master stage 4 before you can really emerge at stage 5 and have meta-systematicity. And the question is really saying, could you be at stage 3 and have some sort of insight taught to you or revealed in a way that would make you stage 5 capable without ever having moved through all the stage 4 markers?
Well, it's also important to remember, to follow up with that sort of clarification, the distinction between stage and state, and how stages are sort of like an average over time of where you tend to be. But people do absolutely engage in the capabilities of higher stages from time to time, despite not having stabilized that, and also regress to the ways of being associated with lower stages from time to time, despite having stabilized a higher stage. So maybe in that sense, yes, but as far as a stable, enduring baseline access to the capabilities of a higher stage, my personal intuition here is that it goes in a fairly scaffolded model.
Chris, you had a few questions. Christy, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, let me just look for my question. Okay. Hey, Evan, what do you think of the opinion that an objective exploration of reality has a very distinct social element, which is not to say that truth itself is socially constructed, but more like socially distributed. And I say that's because even if you have a sort of model for meta rationality, you still have to communicate it, and you still have to make it that it is socially accepted with other people. And so I do see Keegan's stage 3, and I see that the world leaders would embody stage 3. So what do you think of stage 3 playing a role in all this?
So I think I get what you're saying, but could you clarify the question in a slightly more compact way?
How does stage 3 provide a pragmatic explanation of meta rationality in a socially distributed manner?
Okay, so what I'm hearing, let me just check to make sure I'm hearing the question right, is you're asking how one goes about communicating the sort of importance or insights of, say, stage 5 to say stage 3?
Communicating stage 5, but really emphasize the norms, the values of stage 3, and the relationality that comes with it.
So it's an interesting question, and I'm not really sure that that's really a thing that one successfully does. I mean, my impulse answer here is that the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, meaning that if stage 5 sort of performs as advertised, then it should make people pretty consistently more effective at doing whatever it is that they're doing, including interacting in social ways, right? In the sort of communal mode of stage 3. So within the Keegan model, which I do want to emphasize is just a model, and this might be one of the areas, this question, where the model sort of doesn't map as well onto reality as we might like it to. But so within that model, a given stage retains all of the capacities in terms of modes of interacting and ways of relating of all previous stages, right? They're all still available. And so someone who is operating from stage 5 in this model would be able to fluidly operate according to the capacities demanded by the most effective action in the moment. And so if that means operating from a sort of stage 3 communal way of relating in order to accomplish the goal that's at hand, then that's what's done. If it means gently challenging the understandings of people at a lower stage to try and help draw them into a higher stage or invite them into a higher stage, then that would be what was done, and so on. Because a lot of this ends up being highly context dependent, right? In terms of there is no universal stage 5 way of operating other than fluidly responding to the demands of the moment within the context that one has chosen for one's goals and purposes.
What do you think, Evan, of John Vervaeke's 4 Ps of knowing and how they can be communicated differently and how this could interface with what you're presenting here?
So honestly, you're going to have to remind me what the 4 Ps are. I know they're a thing. I always forget the exact letters.
Propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory.
Okay, so I would say that that the way that I would best relate this is that it mainly has to do with the sort of interrelation between those ways of knowing and which ones get emphasized at which times. Because one way to sort of cash this out might be that the sort of incomplete stages, the stages lower than 5, might sort of get stuck in one or more of those ways of knowing, one of those Ps, in a way that is actually counterproductive or not appropriate to the context in which they find themselves embedded in this moment. And so the stage model of Keegan, I think, could be viewed as a sort of progression into being able to come into better alignment or right relationship with those different modes of knowing in the context of situations. Hopefully that makes sense.
Right. Is there any kind of questions that feel alive for you, Evan, to be asked of you? Because people are wanting to double click on vitalism, and there's all these different threads that we can go down. Is there any kind of theme that?
I'm not terribly feeling much of a theme I want to go down. I'm really just interested in, like where is alive for people. I know I kind of maybe covered a lot of ground, and whatever is alive for people, I'm happy to go more into virtualism, though I do think of it as being one useful frame, but I guess I'm more interested in its implications rather than it as a frame. Like, so, okay, what does this do for us rather than what exactly are the details of this? Because that can always be found by just, reading some stuff or whatever. So, but that's, I guess, my only slight preference, but I'm just interested in wherever the group wants to go.
Beautiful. Because we're getting a lot of questions and not much plus one. So I'll just use my discernment, and I will go with Dave Swedlow.
All righty, thanks. Yeah, I was just saying, how does transitioning through a meaning crisis inform care and feeding of the social junctions, kind of greasing the cogs and gears as they come flying apart is the way that I worded it. But I really mean, we're a lot of this makes sense over a prolonged period of time, but we seem to be in a period of time right now where there's an intense transitional liminal space for a lot of people. So are there, I asked earlier about ecology of practices as well, but it's kind of along the same lines as what basically can we do to make this more practical and pragmatic in the transition as we're getting to crisis point. If you can.
So that actually interestingly ties in, because I'm not able to follow the speed of the chat while also talking, but I've noticed a couple things that have popped up. Kind of asking like, okay, this is pretty theoretical. Like, what do we get for this? What comes out of this? And I think that ties into what you're asking here too. So the reason that I even mentioned virtualism and neurophilosophy in this is because I think that when I look back at the history of sort of movements that are similar to the ones that we see a lot of representatives of on the Stoa, people talking about sense making, people talking about game B, people talking about the meaning crisis, the meta crisis, right? All of this sort of this stuff that's going on, the ecological crisis, right? Yeah, so there have been lots of people talking about similar stuff for a long time, right? You had a sort of structural similarity to a lot of what happened in the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? And these sorts of things fell prey to some pretty predictable failure modes that had to do with, say, staged models of development, first of all, but which also had to do with inadequate philosophical foundations for achieving group coherence and agreement. And so specifically, the reason I talked about something like virtualism and the reason that I talk about neurophilosophical grounding is because a big part of the purpose of this whole bridge project is to try and gesture at or help create a sort of meta-vocabulary for people that are working on these problems and in these spaces across very different areas and backgrounds, right? Something that's not so like culturally loaded, something that doesn't bring in so many implications and so many like conditionings for so many people. Because I think that's one of the big failures of previous sort of movements to social change that recognize the importance of the environment and the failures of global capitalism and all the stuff that we sort of like to go into these spaces, is that so much of the time that was spent on some sort of philosophical turf wars between major players. And I see avoiding those as a sort of requisite for getting through to the solution space. I want to be able to connect with and appreciate the wisdom that's being offered by people, regardless of what tradition, if any, they come from, in terms of their own phenomenological investigation, and also in terms of their way of relating to the big problems of the world, right? And so, like, the fact that virtualism can act as a sort of bridge between several different, like, fundamental philosophical positions that have existed historically within Western philosophy, I see as having value in that space. And similarly, I think that staged adult developmental models like Keegan stages, like spiral dynamics, like the stages model, I'm not wedded to the Keegan stages, it's just the simplest one, which is why I happen to choose it for this presentation or for this series. That essentially that these are some of the missing pieces that have been what doomed previous movements trying to accomplish what we all here seem to be trying to accomplish in terms of dealing with the meta crisis. So maybe that sort of answers your question, or if you have a follow-up, I'm not sure.
I do have a brief follow-up, and it's kind of bringing it to a little bit more of a kind of a, what I'm thinking is that the bridge, as you mentioned bridge, I think that the important thing about that is not so much the thought of how do we build a bridge that we move across, but I'm becoming the bridge. And in a sense, what I really think that means is that there's a deep way that I'm learning to transition as my thought about what trust means changes dramatically. Trust of my own interior epistemology, trust of how do I know something, as it breaks down where it looks like, oh shit, I don't know. How do I know who to trust as a news source? I don't know. How do I know which to trust as a scientist that's worthwhile paying attention to with COVID? I don't know. And so I'm trying to find that in myself as I'm finding new social structures and ways to do this collectively. So that trust element is a really big piece as we move through this point in particular in time. I think is a very key part of this. It's pragmatic in a way that's less philosophical.
Yeah. So trust has to do, in some senses, at least historically has, with shibboleths, right? So what I mean by this is that you might find yourself disinclined to trust someone because they're using different languagings than you are of things, and they're not speaking the right shibboleths, right? So, for example, the way that people are pretty hardcore into like scientism, as I described it in the last session, might distrust someone who describes some sort of subjective or phenomenological or intersubjective phenomenological practice to them, because they're describing it in words that are a shibboleth for a competing tribe, essentially, right? A competing mimetic tribe. And so this sort of bridging motion or this bridging action, this bridging gesture has to do with noticing the extent to which different ways that we've historically approached reality are often seemingly in conflict, but not actually in as much conflict because they're dealing with fundamentally different domains, right? In the sense of the domain of the subjective, the domain of the intersubjective, or the domain of the objective, right? And again, this is something valuable that you can get out of, say, Forrest's eminent metaphysics, is this concept of the different domains being both, in some sense, like distinct, but also inseparable and intertwined, right? And that's why, virtualism appeals to me, because it sort of bridges the domain of the subjective phenomenology and the objective physical reality in a way where we can respect people who are experts in one without requiring them to use the language of the one that we're more comfortable with, if that makes sense.
I'm going to double click on something Ali said about creating a vocabulary, meta-vocabulary, which as you mentioned, and I'm talking to a lot of players in this space and we're thinking of doing that. So Ali, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, I was just wondering sort of what that looks like practically, because you're talking about all these shibboleths and all these different vocabularies that we're all comfortable using in our own day-to-day transpersonal interactions, but how do we unify that in a way that spans all of that? I mean, I feel like that's what this series is the main goal. Like that's the bridge we're looking to build. So what's the first step there? Like, how does that look? And I know you touched on virtualism, but I think for maybe the more mainstream that we might be wanting to reach in stage 3, or if you want to use that vocabulary, then how does that actually pragmatically look and sound?
So I think that part of this is that this is going to take a lot of people, right? So whatever I do or don't do with the bridge is extremely unlikely to be a complete solution for this problem space. So that being said, because people have asked me, and you just mentioned, and people have asked me, since the first session about this sort of like, well, what about the 3 to 4 thing, right? And honestly, my answer to that has something to do with being pretty unqualified to talk about that bridge. Like, that's really not like my thing. And so I'm happy to work with people who are investigating that aspect of this underlying territory, whatever the 3 to 4 transition is gesturing at in the territory. But for me, I don't feel like I'm as suited to personally do the work in that space, right? I tend to just sort of resonate more with, vibe with, work better with the sort of 4 to 5 transition space, as far as my personal interests and, you know, what sort of things call to me to explore. And so I think that, like I said, this is going to take a village. This is going to take a tribe. I mean, you know, whatever you want to say, this is going to take a lot of people. And I think that a lot of other people are doing good work in this space. And, you know, some of that is work I've leaned on in putting together this series. And you know, places like the STOA are sort of some coordination points for a lot of people that do feel like they're doing some, you know, similar flavored work at several different levels of the needed transitions. And so I guess, you know, I don't aim for anything I've put out here to be definitive. I aim for it to be a gesture in a certain direction. So for example, I like the move of talking about phenomenological self-inquiry because I personally think it can encompass, say, what the Buddhists are talking about in terms of insight meditation, as well as what you see referred to in a lot of Christian traditions as wordless prayer, right? To me, those both have a similar underlying structural element to them that we might describe as phenomenological self-inquiry or just phenomenological inquiry, right? And so a lot of times, though, you get these communities of practitioners who don't talk to each other because they can't agree on a shared terminology. So I'm trying to offer my best effort at an attempt, an essay at shared terminology, and also by doing that gesture to invite other people to collaborate in creating the best shared terminology that can allow the most people that have done the most work to coordinate and communicate effectively in service of helping to solve the meta crisis and, you know, hopefully save the planet or whatever, you know, but that's a bit grandiose, but at least just to encourage better communication between practitioners of different traditions, both scientific, philosophical, and self-inquiry.
And to double click on that, like you said, the STOA is holding an interesting position right now. It's sort of a node for a lot of these thinkers, and how the space is being held has the capacity to invite different people. So as you mentioned, Frank Yang agreed to have a talk with Daniel Ingram. So we're going to have that soon, and you might be involved in that. What would your be advice for a space like this, or a space that precedes it, another iteration of it, how to invite these thinkers in collaboration with each other in such a way that new insights might emerge?
So I think it's really interesting. You know the classic advice of like, what's interesting is not really what smart people agree about, but what they disagree about, right? Like if you really want to get to the meat of a field, you find what the experts disagree about and you investigate that. And so I think that provides a sort of interesting guiding principle here, because when we look at say some of the panels that have happened on the STOA, some of the interesting you know, generative conversations that have happened on the STOA, it seems to be a manifestation of that sort of thing, right? Where we have you know, people who are deep experts along some pretty similar lines, and they end up kind of discussing some of the edges or the overlaps of where they might want to language things differently and where they might want to disagree. And so then you get some generative conversation where by the end of it, often these people are all now speaking the same language in a certain sense, right? And then because of the status of these people as, you know, I hate the term, but thought leaders in their respective communities, seeing them come to that point of agreement of a common language, right, together in the events here might have some really interesting trickle down effects, or, you know, diffusion type effects into the communities that are influenced by them. Does that make sense? So
yeah, I love it. It's like a trickle down galaxy brain. You know, you find the intersection of where they can language together, and then that
right,
will have the
and especially invite them to build languagings together in real time here, right? Because I've seen a lot of that happening kind of spontaneously, or maybe you've been carefully, you know, curating and manipulating this whole thing behind the scenes, and this was your plan all along. But whatever it is, it's been working, and I like seeing more of that.
And in contrast that with someone like Peterson with Vervaeke, who I both know, Peterson's in combat mode, mostly in the culture war, at least when he was in broadcast mode, where Vervaeke, you see him reprogramming himself in the moment with all these other people at that intersection that we referred to.
Yes, and Vervaeke is extremely admirable in that respect.
Right. All right. Ryan just threw in a question. I haven't read it, but I trust his discernment. So Ryan, you're up.
I don't know if you should trust it. It's about trust. So I just revisited Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, a Tom Stoppard play, which is like one of my favorite all-time plays. And it reminded me of those Hamlet words, words, they're all we have to go by. And so we're talking about language as a mechanism of trust. And I wonder, is language an adequate mechanism for the distribution of trust? And can trust exist without language? And then if it can, how do we enable a cross-domain trustworthiness, either with a shared language or sans language?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question. And God, this gets really deep. So first of all, it's not clear what the actual referent of language is here. Are we restricting ourselves to naturally evolved human languages with written and spoken forms? Are we talking about computer games? Are we talking about, say, the generalization that's happened in some fields of, say, the Wittgensteinian concept of language games to include physical interaction as well, where, say, improv could be viewed as a language game? Because there's different answers depending on what the referent is there, right? But I would say if we want to take the very general sort of concept of language as a sort of shared grammar, which could include both the syntax and semantics, right? A shared mode of mapping representations to meanings, then I think that it's pretty essential for trust and trust building, right? Because, for example, in our culture, we have the handshake gesture, right? And in other cultures, they may have other gestures that serve a similar purpose. And maybe there's some subtle differences, right? And so we're still relying on a shared context of what that means. Or if you think about like the sort of subcultures where like you greet people by hugging them versus the sort of subcultures where hugging somebody who you barely know is considered a sort of transgression, right? Those are different languages in a certain sense, right? And so, I think that we need to use something that fits this extremely broad, criterion of language, like the sort of generalized language game, in order to establish trust between humans. But I must say, I am suspicious that the idea that we can fully establish the kind of trust that matters through solely mediated language. And I mean, what I mean by solely mediated is I'm leaving aside for a second the concern that all of our experience is mediated through our nervous system. And I'm talking about the idea of sharing physical space with one another, right? I think that can be really foundational to trust, and that it's probably possible to establish real deep shared trust with someone without sharing physical space with them, but that's doing it on the extra hard mode, right? There's an immense conduciveness of sharing physical space and the sort of languages that emerge from our embodiment. That is, we have a ton of like exquisitely evolved neural wetware for most people, at least, that makes that like almost a free action. Whereas establishing the same level of trust over Zoom, say, I think is possible, but much harder, right? And so I do think that in this sense, there should be an emphasis on embodied practice, right? And you'll notice that that's exactly the next section of the bridge, is relating with embodied practice, because I do see it as essential to building the sort of trust networks that we need to successfully bridge these divides and hopefully navigate the current moment.
Any follow-up, Ryan?
Yeah, awesome. Really appreciate that answer. So you talked a little bit about the origins of the CNS and the development of the CNS, and I might have missed what you just said right there, like the trajectory of the CNS and its relationship to trust. But the thing I heard you put forth was, okay, let's say there's a neuron or there's life, and the life models reality so that it has some type of motility, and then it tests reality by moving. The ultimate reason for it moving is to continue life, i.e. reproduce. Is that kind of your trajectory of life and CNS development?
Yeah, I mean, like that's the beginning part of the trajectory, but not the complete trajectory at all, because when you look at the development of advanced CNSs and social species, right, then you observe the sort of connection, the networked nature of the, say, mirror neurons and that area of the brain with the areas of the brain responsible for our own experience of emotions, right? Things like the amygdala and so on, right? So you will notice this deep connection whereby empathy is an evolved capacity, right? It's not something that, I mean, now there are non-neurotypical manifestations of human genomes as phenotypes out there for which this may not be true, but for the modal human, we do have an evolved capacity for what you could call a felt sense of what it's like to be someone else. And this, I think, is foundational to trust.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I was looking for. Like origins and development of trust alongside CNS development.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks.
James Baker, you had a question.
Yeah, hello. Hi, Evan and friends.
James.
My question is, are there any alternatives to virtualism? Is it essentially, to borrow some David Chapman language, is it like the complete stance where there's only one of them and everything else is confused, or are there competitors or alternatives to it that you know of?
Well, I guess I assume there must be, right? Like virtualism is sort of the best understanding of how to relate to the relationship between my subjective experience and I'm forgetting the exact quote, but sort of the uncanny power of physics and science and mathematics to describe the external world, right? Because honestly, most of us don't experience the external world, or we don't experience our world, our subjective world, as anything like what physics describes the real world as being, right? We're not just floating around in some sort of quantum soup or foam with constantly interleaving boundaries and, superpositions and all this kind of crazy stuff. No, we're experiencing a world where there are discrete enduring objects and where we are a self. And that's the sort of normal experience for most people, right? And these are so incredibly different that, like, historically speaking, they've almost been viewed as, a term you'll hear is like separate magisteria, right? So we've got the magisterium of like spirituality or religion and the magisterium of science, right? And you could say that gradually science has been sort of like chipping off from the magisterium of spirituality or religion, because religion used to be the sort of thing that made a bunch of, ontological claims about the physical universe. And, it's doing less of that now. But there's still the sense that most people have of these being separate magisteria, right? And that's fine. And that's actually a really pragmatically useful way to approach things in most cases, right? But that will lead you deeply astray if you're trying to really come to grips with questions of meaning, purpose, and value. And so we need some way to bridge those magisteria. And to me, virtualism is the best way I know of doing that right now. Do I think it's the ultimate truth? Hell no, it's just another model. It's just another way of explaining things in words. And so I'm open to the existence of other ways of explaining the same, sort of interrelating of these fields, right? You could say in essence that, like, I don't know that, say, Forrest Landry would agree that his eminent metaphysics is an instance of virtualism. But I think that if you read and understand that book, it also provides a pretty satisfactory squaring of that circle and a pretty satisfactory description of the interface as well as the difference between these different domains, probably in a more complete way than like the standard notion of virtualism does. But it's also a much denser and more difficult thing to unpack than the idea of virtualism, especially within a limited time constraint. So therefore, virtualism is like a good enough solution to get the point across, and that's why I went with it.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, so good enough then to get us to week 2 and embodied practice?
Basically, yeah. Because, and so that's just as a quick follow-up there. Yeah, like taking a frame like virtualism will let you approach embodied and subjective and intersubjective practice in a way that is less confused and more effective than taking any of the standard alternatives to virtualism will. So that's why I find it to be pragmatically useful. I think something that might be considered characteristic of stage 5-ishness would be a pragmatic attitude towards truth and utility rather than an unceasing attempt to ground something in some ultimate notion of one or the other that's domain agnostic, that applies to all different domains.
Cool. Jen has a question. Got a few plus ones. If you can unmute yourself, Jen.
Yeah, my question was, do we actually need this bridge? Do we need virtualism, or could we just not learn how to just allow the paradoxes to be?
So I think the answer to that is probably pretty dependent on an individual's circumstance. And so I think it was earlier this session when Peter asked me sort of like, who is the target audience for the Bridge series? And my answer to that was, well, it's primarily people who arrived at their sort of like stage 4 systematic mode understanding through, STEM education and practice. So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And something that I've noticed is that among the people who I actually know who fit that description, right? That there tends to be a real intense desire to sort of ground out the understanding of things in some sort of theory, right? In some sort of overarching theory. And, I think that that's ultimately not possible, but I think that virtualism is the sort of theory or approach to that can be just satisfying enough for just long enough to get to the point where you were describing, essentially.
So what you're saying really, I suppose it literally is a bridge. It's not, the bridge is not the place you stay. The bridge is the thing you use to walk over to the next stage.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, think about it just literally, like if you're sleeping on a bridge, you're probably not in such a good place, right? And so you should probably keep walking. And yeah, the bridge itself is specifically a gesture at a crossing motion rather than a final destination. I actually don't suspect that the concept of final destination maps on to any sort of good way to live one's life personally. But people will tend to maybe get stuck in certain areas, and if you can point them to a bridge, then maybe they can cross it and at least keep the journey going.
Cool, thanks.
So related to that, you text me something, a suggestion to call, I think, the Frank Yang, Daniel Ingram conversation, aporia, awakening, and dialogos, or then you change the order of operation, aporia, dialogos, awakening, which kind of maps over to at least 3 of the themes that you're talking about here at the bridge. Could you describe that, explain that triplicate that I just said, and then double click on aporia, how it relates to neurophilosophy, and perhaps how to get people in conversation with each other?
Sure, yeah. So aporia literally in Greek means pathlessness. It means being in the state where you don't have a path, right? And it's used in the philosophical tradition in a way that speaks to a certain kind of confusion, right? A not knowing. And so this is seen in a lot of different ways of doing philosophy and phenomenological investigation as sort of like the first step, right? The prerequisite, where you kind of feel lost. You're like, shit, my tools aren't working anymore. I'm disoriented. I don't know what's going on, right? And that actually maps pretty nicely onto what, say, Chapman describes as the nihilistic chasm of Keegan stage 4.5, right? So in terms of a place where you're starting from or where you might be, there's this sense of a lack of directionality, of not knowing where you're going, of aporia, right? And then if you take specifically the mechanism that Socrates used, his elinkos, right? This was intended to both induce and help deal with aporia, right? Like his way of engaging with people was to engage in dialogue in such a way that it induced a feeling of aporia in them, right? Does that make sense so far? And so I think you could say that probably most of the relatively well-to-do Greeks that Socrates was interacting with, at least as we have recorded in the dialogues, none of which he wrote down, right? But it's from Xenophon and Plato. We're sort of looking at this as so he meets people who think they know something very definite. You could say that they are, from the frame we've been using in the bridge so far, they're very firmly in Keegan stage 4, right? Where you believe that there is such a thing as an overarching meta-narrative that can explain everything. You believe that even if you don't quite have it right now, there is one system that will explain everything, that can handle and contain everything. And so he knows that people need to get to aporia to really start the journey past that into the next stage, which he himself knows about because he's there. And so his method for doing that is elenkos, which means roughly scrutiny or testing or cross-examination, literally in Greek, right? This is his method. This is his sort of like intentionality that he brings to the practice of Dialogos, right? And so through Dialogos, with the intention or, framing of elenkos, he then induces aporia. And this aporia can then result, and often does in the dialogues and in the interlocutor experiencing some level of awakening, because aporia itself could be considered a form of awakening, which would essentially be that you had a dream that you thought you understood things. And now you've woken up from that dream into the reality of the fact that you actually don't understand things. And that itself is a prerequisite for generating any kind of real understanding and any kind of real, like, life positive way of dynamically interacting with each moment.
And could you explain the other two aspects of the triplicate, how it's related, the Dialogos and then awakening?
Right. So I went into the Dialogos a little bit there, but so basically you start, so let's say you start from aporia, right? So like we are now in a state of aporia, right? We've successfully met somebody like Socrates, and it's like, oh crap, everything I thought I knew, I don't know, right? I think a lot of the people who are seen as thought leaders within the communities that the Stoa is drawing from and having as guests are kind of in this place where they've achieved a real sort of epistemic humility, right? And known how much they don't know. Well, then how can we possibly generate any sort of real knowing, right? Well, one possible path is the phenomenological, introspective path that I've described so far in the previous bridge section, right? I think that that's one path among many, and another path, or maybe you would say a complementary aspect of that path. We could go back to the sort of prerequisites for any valid knowledge quest that I talked about last time. It is a Dialogos process where, okay, you do some sort of investigation, but then you have to test your understanding by engaging in Dialogos with other people who have done similar testing of their own understanding, right? And you probably are not going to get to any sort of awakening unless you do that sort of Dialogos, right? So like in the sort of Buddhist model, the Sangha is part of the triple gem. That is like the things you need. You need some sort of faith that awakening can exist. You need some sort of recognition of dukkha, which in this case, I think can be slantwise translated as to a felt sense of aporia. And you also need the Sangha. You need the Dialogos aspect, right? And that the combination of these things can lead to some sort of awakening. And I think that's very much what Socrates was on about, though in a very different place, though at a similar time to the original Buddha.
Great. So we're approaching the bottom of the hour. We have about 5 minutes left. And I've been on Zoom calls for like over 2 hours, so I have to go pee. So we'll close it out here. And I just want to give you a chance for any closing thoughts, Evan, and maybe set up next week.
Yeah, so basically the directionality of the bridge, I covered a little bit in that last slide. And so the place we're going to be moving into now is going to have to do with what practices might actually look like. So, part of my motivation for creating this bridge thing is this idea that we basically, it's really easy to get lost. You have this sense of aporia, this pathlessness, and it's really easy to latch on to anybody that promises a credible path without using so much discernment to figure out whether this path is actually going to lead you anywhere, or whether it's going to be the path that's no real path at all, as Parmenides put it, right? And so, which leads you stuck in aporia again. So in this sense, one thing that I spent about 15 and a little bit more years doing was investigating all sorts of different paths that exist in a lot of different ancient and some more modern traditions, regarding what to do when you're feeling a sense of aporia, or what to do when you're sort of in the nihilistic chasm of stage 4.5 Keegan, as it's described by David Chapman, because that was a brutally wrenching experience to be stuck in, and I had nothing better to do with my life than try to figure out how to get out of it. That being said, I think about 10 of those 15 years were essentially wasted when I look back in retrospect, because there's such poor quality ability to distinguish between signal and noise. As I mentioned earlier, most of these ancient traditions have such garbage epistemologies, ontologies, axiologies, and metaphysics that like there's a lot of chaff mixed in with the wheat. And so this next session is sort of intended to be a bit of a distillation of what I've noticed as the common underlying structural principles of the sort of things that work within the space of embodied, subjective, and intersubjective practice. And then that'll, of course, take us into the next week, which is about how this might apply into the more fully intersubjective realm with questions of community, trust, and working in groups. So that's kind of where we're going. And then the fourth session is going to be very speculative and is coming alive as I sort of engage with it. And so that's going to be just like throwing some stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, to be perfectly honest. But I think it'll at least be interesting, even if people don't agree with it. So, yeah.
Beautiful. So I'll make some closing announcements in a moment. But Evan, thank you so much for agreeing
Thank
to
you.
be.
One other thing. Sorry, I just wanted to mention, I'm throwing a link to the Bridge Discord into the chat if people who have attended one or more of the sessions want to join it. We talk about this stuff there. And I'll also be throwing a link to the slides in the chat. So just wanted to mention that for people who are interested. And sorry to interrupt, I'll hand back over to you.
No worries. And I'll leave the Zoom room open a little bit so people can log on there. But Evan, thanks so much for agreeing to be sense maker in residence and blowing our minds once again. I'm looking forward to rewatching this, as I'm sure many people here are as well.
Thanks for having me.
So on Wednesday, we have an event at Rob is going to be emceeing. If you can unmute yourself and plug that event.
Yeah, so we are hosting a guest, Anita Williams-Woolley. She is a doctorate of education who is the, let me look it up, sorry, the associate professor of organizational behavior and theory at Carnegie Mellon University. She's also a lead researcher in an emerging field called collective intelligence, which aims to use scientific method approaches to answer questions like, why do big groups of smart people do dumb things? So the idea of collective intelligence is still kind of like held in question by many in the scientific community, yet it can be studied scientifically and appears to exist somehow. And so it's quite an amazing thing to read up on. I've been reading Anita's work for a while now and really interested in talking to her. We're going to dive into things like how to create trust and psychological safety in teams, how do groups get smarter without their members getting smarter. So these kind of things will lead to a great discussion, and this will be a group that will probably give her brand new questions to think about. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation.
Yeah, I'm super excited for that as well. Apparently she was like working with the CIA and all this type of stuff. So she has a wealth of experience. And then I think Saturday, if it's not Saturday, correct me, David, we have an event that you're emceeing, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, really excited that we're bringing Frank Hiley to the STOA for a two-part series called Consciousness and Spirituality Explained. What I really like about Frank's models are they're based in science. They're entirely commensurate with physics. In fact, he was a working physicist while developing these models. And I think it will dovetail really nicely with some of the things we heard today from Evan, and I think it'll help us understand virtualism. And really looking forward to seeing many of you there.
Beautiful. 2 bridge-friendly events coming up and many more in 2021. You can check out the events at the STOA. We have Patreon and Substack. That being said, Evan, everyone, thanks for coming to the STOA today.